Well, good evening, everyone, and welcome to the Brian Crombie Radio Hour on Saga 960. We've got a by-election, a Toronto mayoralty election coming up in just under 2 weeks, 10 days or something like that. It's coming up real quick. And I thought I would check in with two very knowledgeable public policy-oriented individuals, political individuals that know a lot about what's going on, both in Toronto, but also in politics in general and democracy in general. Murray Simpson runs a company and an app called Citizen that is really trying to change democracy and well, maybe not change democracy, but make things more democratic. And so he's got a really interesting view. He's been involved in politics. He worked on Parliament Hill at one point in time. He's worked in Silicon Valley, and he's a really smart guy. And Nick Rakowski, who runs his public affairs, government relations company. He's in Ottawa, but he knows a lot about politics. I used to work with Nick, and I know he's very political and knows politics and public affairs incredibly well, and government and what's going on. So I thought it would be an interesting conversation today. We've got this election coming up, gentlemen. There's over 100 people on the ballot. There is a dog on the ballot. There's been a bunch of debates with different people that have only had 5 or 6 people on the podium. What do you think? Is this actually, Murray, democratic?
Well, it's democratic from the standpoint that we have set the system up this way. This is the system, and this system has always worked this way. I think what's germane to your question is, should it remain the way we set it up? And I think what we're seeing now is the system itself being outgrown by the people that it's supposed to serve. And when you start to get a bunch of joke candidates, single-issue candidates, students that want to be on Instagram candidates, and most impressively, a guy who represents a dog who would like dog parks improved, you really do have to ask yourself, is the tail wagging the dog?
If at the top of the ballot, you can have someone win with 20 or 30% of the vote, and turnout is only 30 to 40%. So they're only going to have, 10 or 15% of the people in Toronto actually vote for them.
Yeah.
Is that democratic?
Well, it's not. And in fact, we touched, I think it was 28% in the last election a couple of years ago. You have to ask yourself if a budget of $10 billion plus, a deficit of $1.5 billion, a capital budget of almost $50 billion should be managed in this way. All three of us have been fiduciaries for very large corporations and been responsible for other people's money. Could you imagine running the senators that you both ran, for instance, the hockey club, without giving consideration to that cash? The truth of the matter is the person at the top of the ballot will likely get more votes than many of the people we see in the debates. And that itself, who picks the people in the debates, is a whole other question.
Nick, you're in Ottawa, and so you've sort of seen this from a little bit of afar. What do you think? What's going on?
Well, part of it is a bit comical in a sad way, but comical nonetheless, Brian, which is that, as you know, Canada has at least on 3 occasions in the last 4 general elections that I can remember grappled with the issue of election reform at the federal level. The result of that grappling is that we're no further ahead than we've ever been. We're still all in a first past the post system. And so this is one of the rare occasions where, notwithstanding the complicated feelings that Canadians may have about Toronto, where Toronto is actually a very impressive mirror image of the rest of the country. It has been bogged down in this first past the post system. I don't see a clear path forward for how that gets changed. And so in many ways, what you're grappling with at the municipal level is very similar to what the country has been grappling with at the federal level as it relates to the manner in which we elect our candidates. I will say, perhaps to disagree with Murray just a little, I'm not sure I would say it's not democratic, but I would say it is a suboptimal approach to electing individuals when you've got participation rates, which I believe in the last mayoral election in Toronto peaked at 29.7%. And so
Peaked or
that
valley?
is a concern. That is a very, very big concern in terms of the quality of the democracy that we have in place. I'll be additionally controversial, I think, at least vis-a-vis Murray's point of view, that I'm not sure that the answer lies in a reform to the system. We've got to think a little bit about how it is that politicians behave and political parties and candidate lists organize themselves as really the first and most important area to fix, because the one area where we all have control is how we behave and how we choose to put ourselves forward in the world. That's a lot easier to influence than the manner in which we get elected.
Sorry, I don't understand your point, Nick.
Politicians behaving badly results in low turnout. That's my thesis. And that's got a much bigger impact, I think, than any one aspect of the electoral system that we would put in place. And so that may be the first place to start looking, is what kinds of behaviors we encourage and demand of the politicians who represent us. So
we've got low turnout in municipal elections across Canada, I think, and the one election that I think in the recent past has bucked that trend is Vancouver, and some people say that that increased because you had political parties and council and mayor got together to put forward a very different agenda. So why do you think it is politicians acting badly that's causing the low turnout?
It's a trend that I've observed over the course of my entire career in democratic development, whether that's in Canada at the federal level, the municipal level here in Ottawa, the provincial level in Ontario and Quebec. It's a trend that I've observed in Central and Eastern Europe across 7 or 8 different democracies. It's a trend that I've observed in France, where in spite of relatively high turnout compared to us, there is lowering turnout over the course of history. And I think that the one thing that those things all have in common, those jurisdictions, is they all have very different electoral systems. So I don't think we can pin the blame down on the nature of how we choose people. I think there's something bigger at play, something more fundamental. And I think the less people recognize themselves in the issues and in the approaches that the politicians choose to focus on, the harder it is for them to embrace the relevance of the democracies in which they operate.
Fascinating. That's really quite interesting, because I was thinking it was the system and the way we elect, and that proportional representation or preferential vote or compulsory voting or something like that would all solve the problem. And you're saying no, it's about the people and what they do.
I think it's a combination of the people and the systems. When you have systems that reward behaviors, and look, I'm not talking about I'm not setting a high bar here. I'm not talking about behavior that I would consider to be, virtuous in the grandest sense. I'm talking about much more basic principles. Like finding common ground as opposed to picking the most polarizing approach to an issue that will help segment the electorate into small little silos that might prefer one option or another. We've started treating politics the same way that cable companies treat broadcasting, these micro-targeted approaches to building campaigns. And the virtue that I'm asking for is, can we start embracing the virtue of the things that unite us and that we have in common in terms of interest as a way to build a campaign, as opposed to focusing on the things and the ideas that divide us. That's my starting point, as opposed to any grand ethical or policy scheme.
Fascinating. Murray, what do you think?
Well, I agree with Nick. But I also agree with you. I think that the system needs to change, but I don't think you can change the system by rearranging deck chairs, as Nick pointed out. I mean, whether you have this voting system or that voting system, I'm sure it can modify something in the short term, but ultimately the incentives in the system are wrong. And this is sort of my thesis that underpins the work I've done for the last 5 years, is that you cannot ask a player in a game, let's just take game theory, okay, to behave outside of their interest. And right now, the interests that politicians have, that is to win, gain the confidence of the House, the federal level, and the provincial level, but gain a seat as a councillor or a mayor in a municipal election, requires exactly what Nick said, this sort of very base level of engagement with society, this micro-targeting, this virtue signaling, group-based approach to politics. And you can't blame the players. Okay, this is really important. I mean, politicians are this, politicians are that. They're not. Politicians are doing precisely what we, the people, have laid out for them. And until such time, my thesis, I think Brian and Nick, is that we must modify as the people of a country, just like when we set up parliaments through civil wars hundreds of years ago. We took control of our countries, and we took control of our democracies, and we fundamentally altered the incentive model that was built into the system. And that gave us representative democracies. That's what we're talking about today. Several hundred years later, that system is starting to fall apart because it was built for a non-communications technology environment. And now we have these great communications technologies where basically everybody has access to all the information. So the talking head politician is irrelevant. We need a better system. And so if you don't modify the incentives, and that has to happen outside of the system, within the people, and this is where I agree with Nick, we need to elevate politicians to something akin to a higher standard. And it's up to us to be able to do that. Citizens' objective, our company, is to create the infrastructure necessary for that to happen. And if you do that, and specifically, you alter the fabric of a political contest. Today in Toronto, you look at all of the debates that have taken place. Now, I want you to tell me what the difference is between Saunders and Bielo and Hunter and on and on. The voters today absolutely don't know the difference between any of them. Olivia Chow to Matt Lowe. These things, that's a problem when politicians are indistinguishable one from the other, because it means that they have to use techniques that are divisive. And those divisive techniques, the micro-targeting, ultimately is a Faustian bargain that the people have made with the politicians, because you disenfranchise huge groups of people every time you use a wedge in politics. You get away from the real issue and you get into what pisses people off. And that, I don't think that's, again, I go back to the concept, I don't think that's the right model to manage our largest capital plants in our democratic world.
Well, it's going to be interesting. We're going to see what happens in less than 2 weeks' time. I think all the polls are suggesting that the people right now are going to be making the decision on one thing alone, which is name awareness. What name do they recognize more than any else? And so I think, Murray, you're right that these debates have been not overly helpful. They haven't really distinguished, though we do have different policies and people that are at very different places on the political spectrum that are running. But I don't think everyone recognizes it. And in the end, it's going to be what name do they recognize that probably is going to win it. Anyway, we're going to take a break for some messages and be back in just 2 minutes with Murray and Nick. Stay with us, everybody. Welcome back, everyone, to the Brian Crombie Radio Hour on Saga 960. We're chatting tonight about really the Toronto Mayoralty election, but more importantly, democracy itself, and the implications of what we're seeing in this Toronto by-election, mayoralty election, and its implications on democracy, our electoral system in municipalities and provinces in Canada, federally today. My guests are Murray Simpson and Nick Rakowski, two people that have got long involvement in the political process in Canada, and in different ways. Murray running a company, and Nick being a public affairs, government affairs consultant, being very involved in democracy and politics still today. Let's focus on the election for a couple of minutes, if we could. Murray, what you were saying was that people are being divisive, and Nick, you were saying micro-targeting. So we've got two people on the right. One that's been very focused on criminal justice issues and getting tough on crime. Another one that is focused on safe injection sites and that they're bad, and pointing out a whole bunch of things in that. And so that they have been appealing to people that are concerned about that, and that may be micro-targeting, but it also is a real concern that people have of violence on the TTC and drugs and street people, etc. And then you've got some people in the center that have been focused on housing, on transit, on Ontario Place and the Science Center, which is this kind of strange issue that's come in that is sort of a self-manufactured own goal. I'm not sure where it came from, but the premier made some recommendations, some policy recommendations that sort of took everyone by surprise, and now people are commenting on that. And then we got people on the left that haven't actually, and maybe you guys are more aware of it, but haven't been talking about a bunch of policy differences. They've criticized the former mayor, and they have been trading off of name awareness.
Yes.
And so it does appear, and maybe if we had political parties, municipally like we have provincially and federally, there'd be some coalescing around the issues and around the candidates far better than there is with the current setup. But I guess bottom line, and I think the polls all suggest that the person with the highest name awareness is leading the polls with potentially 30% of the vote. How do you make a decision as an elector?
Well, so this fundamentally is the issue. Let's just talk about a regular person, okay? Nick and I, we've sort of been part of this for a long time. We can distinguish between good, bad, and uninteresting in that list of 102. I mean, I had my ballot at home. It was this long, okay? Now, I don't know if you can see that, but it's 2 feet. This was the biggest thing I've ever seen. The average voter doesn't know Olivia Chow from Saunders, okay? And the fact of the matter is, who gets the most votes in a municipal election is usually at the top of the ballot. Okay, there's actually a person running, and the name escapes me right now, but the person at the top of the ballot, a very reputable woman, very well educated, very well known. Her whole campaign is, "I'm at the top of the ballot." Yeah, so the answer to the question is, it really boils down to this business of what is your best strength. And when your best strength is, "I'm at the top of the ballot," I mean, it makes a mockery of democracy. And I'm not suggesting this person is doing anything wrong. Were I in her shoes, I would do exactly the same thing, because that's the way to get the votes. The fact of the matter is, right now, there are 102 candidates on there, and the ones that quote unquote matter are decided by the people around us. So right now, most people in Toronto will make their decision based on the debates that they see, based on pamphleteering, based on door knocking, who they like, some sort of amorphous reason that you can't quite pin down. Most people don't make a decision based on, in an educated way, about municipal politics in Canada, and data bears this out. Again, I sort of come back to it. Every one of the candidates agrees on the issues. This is really interesting, okay? Nobody disagrees on the issues. Those issues. So, for instance, the biggest one is housing affordability. Okay, people throw up housing affordability as a thing to manage. This is an economic cycle thing that people are going to find very difficult to manage, even with the weight of the city behind them. And so, at the end of the day, what we're trying to get to is a system that can provide a regular citizen of the city, or in this case, Canada, with better information. And today, that doesn't exist. And so players will play.
But housing affordability, while recognized as an issue, the different candidates have very different solutions.
They definitely do. And so, for instance, you get a spectrum of issues. You've got some that say it's a supply issue. So that means we've got to get all of the red tape out of the way. And about half the candidates agree with that. And then there's the other side of it, that they think we have to start to build Toronto housing. Okay. And what that means is the city would own the land and the building on it and operate it. And then you have various solutions in between those two ends. But again, I sort of say to the average individual, these solutions sound utterly indistinguishable one from the other. It's still a government intervention in a market that won't have any effect. And so let's say just for fun, one of the candidates, and again, I'm not going to say who these candidates are on purpose just by virtue of what I do, but because I don't want to criticize any particular candidate. One candidate, for instance, suggested if we take the land transfer tax away for first-time homebuyers, okay, that this will somehow magically reduce the cost on the sell side of that house. Okay, any sophisticated economist is going to tell you that the seller will just take that money, and so these are solutions once again that are being proposed that don't make mathematical sense, but to a person listening, oh, I'm a first-time home buyer, I love this. They play to that fear they have about not being able to afford a home in Toronto, and the solution that they're offering is utterly irrelevant to solving the problem.
I'm going to jump in here, Brian, and I don't know if I'm taking issue with Murray or not, but I'm looking at this through a slightly different lens, and maybe there's a bit more optimism that I have to express about the wisdom of the crowds, because I spoke earlier about the behavior of politicians and their organizations, but there's some reason for optimism if you think about this from the perspective of the electorate. I would argue that it's not accidental that your law and order candidates are not trending as well as your social justice candidates. Part of that is definitely name recognition. Part of that is, yes, a successful tension between those social justice candidates and their predecessor mayor. But I think part of it is also a certain level of astuteness by the general electorate. The fact is that even though these random acts of violence on the TTC system are on the rise, and we don't know exactly why in Toronto, if you look at the data longitudinally speaking, violent crime in particular and crime in general is down in Toronto over the last several years. Toronto is the safest major North American city on the continent. And I think people intuitively have a sense of those types of realities. And so if you're a candidate over-indexing on law and order, you might be coming across as tone deaf to these members of Joe Public. And likewise, if you're thinking about this in the context of housing affordability, I agree with Murray that people probably don't have the expertise or frankly the patience to get into the nitty-gritty of what the ideal policy solution is, and therefore are less likely to see the nuance. But I would venture a bet that most people understand that housing affordability is such a complex problem that no mayoral candidate or no city council can solve it alone at the municipal level without involvement from the province and from the federal government. And so in that context, maybe they're looking for a candidate who's demonstrating some of the abilities that they need, which, by the way, we can all agree John Tory had these in abundance, to work constructively with partners from other levels of government to solve big problems. And so in that context, is it hugely surprising to me that a former federal member of parliament who's associated with a former federal party leader is seen as perhaps having an advantage compared to other candidates? Again, not so much. And so let's not completely discredit the electorate, even though it's participating in smaller numbers than we would like, for having a pretty decent grasp of what some of the big picture elements of the problem are and how to solve them.
Nick, I got to take issue with you. That former federal member associated with a former federal leader was on city council for the vast majority of her career. And there's several other current city councilors that are running. And, Murray said this, I'm not sure if he agrees with this, but he mentioned it. Regulation, over-regulation, red tape is the number one issue. The vast majority of economists, CMHC, banks, et cetera, all suggest in the housing affordability issue.
Oh, I agree.
It takes 2 to 3 times as long to get a development approved as it does to actually build it. It makes no sense whatsoever. And these zoning regulations, these building regulations, this red tape, these committee of adjustments, all this process don't add a lot of value, if any value. And so therefore the provincial government is actually taking a hatchet to all those regulations and overriding them in a great manner. But why should we be electing someone that was part of the problem? Why isn't that like, if they haven't noticed the problem, if they didn't see the problem and they were part of that problem for a long time, why should we be accepting that and electing them again?
Let's be a little bit more wide-eyed. I don't disagree that red tape is hugely problematic, but I think that red tape is not the silver bullet unless you fix that issue in a manner that encourages those on the supply side to increase the supply of housing. Because let's be very honest, every macroeconomic organization in Canada will tell you that our housing supply, especially compared to other members of the G7 and the G20, is absolutely laughable and too small for the amount of demand that we have. So these problems are complicated, they're interconnected, and that's the first thing to do. The second thing to do is, maybe this is where a pox on all your houses has the net effect that we're describing here of favoring some candidates over others. I'm not sure that there is a past, current, or future member of council that won't be tagged with their own share of the blame for any number of problems, including housing affordability. And so part of what's hard to distinguish between candidates is not only the positions that they take on issues, but it's also the relative share of responsibility that they should bear for any given problem. And so in that regard, I'm not sure that Olivia Chow compares so unfavorably as to other candidates as we might think. That's one piece. The second piece, which we haven't touched upon, but which has been a reality in a lot of the both municipal, provincial, and federal campaigns of late, is pollsters have not had a stellar track record of being 100% accurate. I'm coming off the heels of an election in Ottawa where Mark Sutcliffe won a resounding victory as mayor, in spite of the fact that multiple polls at multiple stages in the election had him trailing his challengers quite badly. And so part of what will be interesting to observe in 9 days from now is whether or not pollsters end up having made as precisely a correct call as they would like to, and as we would like to be able to believe, because they don't have a small and insignificant role in the way that we approach these elections either.
Nick, let me ask you one question on that, which I don't think I've understood. I know they asked you, do you intend to vote? But a lot of people will lie about that and say they intend to vote when they don't really. How does a pollster correct for the fact that you've got 20 to 30% turnout? I can understand that if you did a poll via telephone or computer or however you did it, where you might get one result. But if only 1 in 5 people that you talk to actually are going to show up, that's got to have a huge impact. And from what I understand, in municipal elections, it's people that look like the three of us that tend to vote, rather than people that really look like Toronto.
Well, I'm not sure I look like Toronto at all, but that's a separate issue and debate. It's a great question, and I don't know the answer in the absolute, Brian. I can tell you what I understand responsible pollsters try to do, and I can tell you what innovative people in the opinion research business are doing, and where the gap between those two approaches may provide some of the best opportunity to answer that question for the long term. I think responsible pollsters do make a genuine effort to identify those people who are not only registered to vote, who have not only expressed the interest in voting, but also who, demographically speaking, based on the observation that you made, are among the most likely to vote. And they try and make sure that their collection of data converges around those 3 points to make an accurate prediction of the people who are likeliest to turn out. The challenge that they have, methodologically speaking, is, to your point, they only have a questionnaire and a phone bank to do that work. And so they're asking people proactively, and you're correct that some people may, not even through any ill intention, may indicate that they're going to vote when they're not going to, or they may just want to be mischievous and not trusting organizations that collect information on behalf of they don't know who, are not comfortable giving the truth of their point of view in those conversations. That's the current state, and it's widely acknowledged that between that and the transition from landlines to mobile phones, those have been major challenges for pollsters as we see them today in terms of their sample building. People who are on the innovative side of opinion research and using not questionnaires, not phone banks, but artificial intelligence and deep learning to do this work have taken a different approach. They have chosen to build much larger samples, up to 50 to 300,000 people at a time in a city like Toronto. And based on their use of publicly accessible online engagement that's in the public domain, because they've selected through their privacy settings to be in the public domain on Twitter, Facebook, LinkedIn, YouTube, any number of social media, are having conversations organically about the election. And based on their gender, their age, their socioeconomic class, based on the words that they use, based on their knowledge of the issues that they're demonstrating in the course of those elections, leave clues that allow researchers to predict how likely it is that A, these people will turn out, and B, that they're being sincere in their approach as opposed to acting on behalf of other campaigns, trolling, etc. And those types of approach to research, as it's been very well documented by TV Ontario in a documentary that's now 2 years old, are actually far more accurate in predicting results and outcomes than others. The case in point is a Canadian company by the name of Advanced Symbolics that's done tremendous work in this area, not only in Canada, but in the United States, in the European Union, and in many other markets, predicting with extraordinary accuracy how these things play out. I would be very curious to know what Advanced Symbolics thinks will be the result of the election in Toronto, and I'd be willing to bet on their prediction more so than anybody else's, based on the extremely effective approach that their approach takes, because they don't rely on a questionnaire. They don't believe that questionnaire can be trusted. They rely on the conversations that people are having themselves to make those predictions.
So Nick, let me understand this. So they're monitoring our social media communications, and they're extracting from that a sense of what we think, who we're going to vote for, and how likely we are to actually go to the ballot box. Seriously?
That's absolutely correct. Now they're doing it in a way that
Big Brother.
Well, yes and no, in the sense that, when part of what we fail to talk about a lot in democracy is our own responsibility as individuals. So if you're paranoid like me or Murray, you might have all of your social media on lockdown and accessible only to your closest friends so that your conversation remains in a vacuum. But people who don't avail themselves of those opportunities and deliberately or through their own negligence put their conversations in the public domain do leave a trace that can be accessed through social scientists and researchers and through artificial intelligence and deep learning algorithms that allow them the ability to monitor those conversations for content that will be indicative of their voting intentions.
Fascinating. Just unbelievable. We're going to have to take a break for some messages and come back in just 2 minutes with Murray Simpson and Nick Rutkowski talking about the upcoming municipal election, by-election for Toronto mayor, but more importantly, how it impacts the state of democracy in Canada today. Stay with us, everyone. Back in 2 minutes. Welcome back, everyone, to the Brian Crombie Radio Hour on Saga 960. I'm having a chat tonight with Nick Rutkowski. He's a public affairs, government relations expert, consultant, smart guy, been involved in politics, worked on Parliament Hill, and Murray Simpson, who is a technology expert, but also has a long political history, worked as well on Parliament Hill, and has launched a company, Citizen, that is trying to help us in our democracy in Canada. Murray, I want to turn to you if I could. A lot about what Citizen is about and what you were arguing a couple of minutes ago is that we've got to sort of go to a democracy that is more widely shared, where everyone gets a voice. Right now, we're actually in a situation where our provincial government is going the opposite direction with strong mayor powers, and so we're going to be electing someone in less than 2 weeks, probably with, call it 30% of the vote, probably with 30% turnout. And so therefore, there'll only be 10% of the people, maybe, in Toronto that have voted for that candidate. And they're going to have strong mayor powers where they can override the balance of council.
Yep.
Is this democracy?
Well, it is democracy, as I sort of say, in the structure that we've sort of built, it is. But let's be clear, the strong mayor powers are symptomatic of a council system that wasn't working. The reason a politician like Doug Ford can bring up strong mayor powers and suggest these are beneficial political levers to put out there is because if you take the council level now, the municipal level, which is subordinated to the provincial level in Canada, they're basically unanimous consent bodies, and when you have unanimous consent bodies, but all politicians are facing the same sort of wedge issue type environment that we've been talking about, this sort of social media, social justice, social group-based groupthink, they become indistinguishable from each other, and there's no functional outputs from these councils. And so first off, it would be better not to have strong mayoral powers. Okay, but I think Doug Ford's thesis, and I'm not taking a position on it, is that without strong mayoral powers, you get this sort of this gridlock in government, which increases the red tape, if you want to, or the quantum of the red tape that people face, or the lack of progress that people face. I mean, let's be clear. Our cities, they operate pretty well. Okay, I mean, we don't have a massive democratic deficit in Canada. As far as democracies go, we're about as good as they get. But that doesn't mean we shouldn't be aiming for better. And so, my sort of thesis, it sort of comes back to what type of democracy do we really want? If we're happy with that, then maybe strong mayoral powers are a good solution. But to me, it's a reaction to another problem that itself is a reaction to the fundamental issue we're facing as sort of a democratic problem in our society.
So go ahead, Nick.
There's a flip side to that coin. So we can spend a lot of time talking about the system. We can spend a lot of time, as I did, talking about the behavior of political organizations and candidates. But let's not be too quick to let voters off the hook. Nobody is preventing anybody who is 18 years and older and meets the eligibility criteria for the election from registering. Nobody's preventing them from going to the polls. There may be systemic obstacles in some areas where that is made more difficult, but the point is that as a general rule, voters in these and other elections have the ability to turn out and express their vote. Let's not leave members of the public off the hook for owning their own choices, and abstention, whether it's intentional or not, is a choice. And I think that democracy only works if there's equal amounts of responsibility on the shoulders of voters themselves, politicians and political parties, and the systems that voters and politicians conspire to create to get it right. And I worry sometimes in the media, in conversations like this, that we often let citizens off the hook a little too easily. And by the way, that's part of the genius of Murray's idea behind Citizen. Is it only works if individuals take the leap and actually exercise their responsibility to be a part of the conversation. And so I just wanted to emphasize that point, because there's no easy and honest way to get around it. If you want the ability and the opportunity to complain and or shape the system, you better get off your ass and turn up at the polls. Otherwise, I'm not going to feel too sorry for you.
But Nick, it is far easier for me to do my banking than it is for me to vote in a municipal, provincial, or federal election. We've got productivity, technology, et cetera, and every other aspect of our lives, but we're still, writing things out in hand or maybe with a computer. But we've got to go to our local church basement or school gymnasium in our specific poll district to put that vote. And I travel a lot. You travel a lot. I've been out of the city often when there's a vote, and then trying to vote early or by proxy or something like that. We make it difficult for people to vote. And you think about all the comments that we've heard about the United States about making it easier to vote. We make it difficult for people to vote in Canada. And then if you hear poll after poll that says that someone's going to win because of name awareness alone, what motivates you to vote, particularly if you think your vote's wasted because you're going to vote for, maybe the sixth or seventh leading candidate? There's got to be things that we can do that make it far easier to vote and far more effective. And let me just, each one of the political parties in Canada today would not use a first past the post to elect their leaders. They tend to use a preferential vote where you vote for your first choice, your second, third, fourth, etc. And you go through successive ballots until such time, not subsequently in time, but in a computer system, such that someone has to win 50.1%. And people have talked about that for municipal elections. It hasn't been done. That's one system. Chicago elects its mayor with a vote where the top two end up running a week later in a runoff vote. And people would argue, well, it costs a lot more money and turnout goes down. Well, a lot of the established infrastructure is already there, and turnout goes up typically in those second runoff votes. The French presidency is elected that way. There's got to be better ways that we can elect our politicians, motivate people to vote.
There's no doubt that we can improve the system. And I, for one, would embrace two of the things that you said, because I grew up in cultures where they were highly relevant. First of all, I love the French system of runoffs. And by the way, it's not just at the presidential level. It also happens for their legislative elections. And France does have a significantly higher participation rate in their national elections than we do federally. So I endorse that. I also endorse the idea of a digital or online election capability. I think that that's a long overdue reform, that we have all of the capability in the world to instrumentalize and to implement. Going back to your banking example, though, I will simply repeat myself. My banking is extremely relevant to me, and I would go to the bank to make my deposits or my withdrawals, regardless of whether I had online capability or not, because there's no more important pocketbook issue to me than the ability to pay my rent, buy my groceries, make my deposits, pay off my debts, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. And so regardless of the means by which I would make those transactions, they're so fundamental to the ability that I have to thrive that I would do those things no matter how inconvenient. And so part of the improvement that we need to bring to bear is not just process-based or methodological, it's also citizens who take their civic duty more importantly. And by the way, speaking of France, I think part of the cultural difference between France and Canada is there's no country that indexes more on civics education from kindergarten all the way to graduation from secondary school than France does. The idea of citoyenneté is absolutely central to the French identity and culture. And likewise, politicians who take their responsibility to be as relevant as humanly possible so that they can become as relevant as a bank in the lives of their electors also need to follow suit. And by the way, the political parties in which they operate. So there's no one silver bullet. This has to be a multi-pronged approach. Otherwise, there's not going to be a solution.
Let me offer, I'm going to challenge you a little bit on this, Nick, because I think you're right that there are better systems at worst. But let's be clear. If the French system is the measure of the best system, and I love France, okay, loads of my friends are from there, including you. The fact of the matter is France has the other end of the sword with perhaps a little too much independence in their civics. And as a consequence, les banlieues burn in a consistent way, long before the United States, okay? All of the systems, whether good or bad, have the same fundamental issue, and that is disaffection of the voters. And so if we take apathy as sort of the measure, I keep repeating this, and I'll repeat it until I'm done. This is deck chairs, rearranging on the Titanic as far as I'm concerned, okay? The fact of the matter is, by every objective measure, there isn't a democracy in the world that isn't declining in its what we'll call democratic index, okay? And the frustration of voters is manifested in their behaviors. The United States is probably the most recent example of that. The original modern democracy, even before that of France, okay, by a few years. And so the sort of thesis that sort of we can sort of fix the system, I think is, I think that we've done a lot of that. I don't think that ranked ballots would solve the problem, though it may improve the fidelity of who gets elected relative to the people who are actually in the system. But I want to come back to what Brian said, and I'm a technologist. I'm a Silicon Valley hack, and I believe fundamentally in technology. I think we've done everything we can to maximize the value of democracy. And look, we live in these beautiful cities that, it's done well for us. We can't throw the baby out with the bathwater. But the fact of the matter is that if you look at, just take our friend groups, your friend groups in the world, it's hard to get them out to dinner. When you've got kids and lives and a job and these sorts of things. And if you really want to actively participate in politics, as say the three of us have in our lives, that's a mega commitment of time. Okay. If you want to have any major influence in politics at all, most people can't afford the time. And that's why technology needs to play a role. And here's the sort of short answer. It's even worse with kids. Okay, so the sort of Gen Z that are coming up, if it's not on here, it doesn't exist. Okay, and that's where happily there's a solution that exists to bridge between these two worlds of the digital world and this. And Advanced Symbolics, Erin, who's the CEO and the founder, she's done a terrific job of taking all of the public information and sort of identifying signals within that so as to better express the will of the people. That has solved a lot of the problems. And in point of fact, her stuff will generally predict, even on the day of the election, you may think, oh, she missed it. But then a month later, you see the data is correct within her system. And I think the last federal election showed that. Public sentiment analysis is strong, it's good, but again, there's one more thing that can go. So we have polling, we have public AI sentiment analysis, takes the public data that's out there, and these two things are terrific. But it still doesn't get to the fundamental problem of integrating each individual citizen into their democracy. And you need one more set of data above that. And that's what Citizen does, which is to capture and instrument every citizen and allow them to participate in their democracy with like 2 minutes a day on a couple of notifications on their phone to become citizens who have given informed consent to those who govern them. That's what's missing. We need a new layer of informed consent at the top. And today, let's be crystal clear. If you watch the City TV debate 2 days ago, this was a bunch of people who I know very well who were screaming at each other. And in point of fact, the only thing that was taken away from that debate on social media in the comments from regular people are, why are we even watching this? We can't understand them. We can't hear them. They won't listen to each other. They won't talk. They won't communicate, which again means they go back to the base. It becomes tribal. And then, Olivia Chow gets a bit of a left group and Saunders a bit of the right prime group and, a bunch of people in between. We need something that digitizes the electoral system. And let's be clear, the thing that has resisted digitization since .com has been government. The largest graveyard of digital products and companies that have failed is e-government. And that's why it's really hard to sort of do this. You talk about political parties as a solution, Brian, in Vancouver. One of the councillors who was not reelected recently, who ran one of the parties, a group of sort of councillors that got together and called themselves this party or that party. She herself owns and runs a digital, a digital platform that allows for councillors to directly talk to their people. Hasn't solved anything. You really need to rethink the relationship between the people and their government. And the only way, and I mean this, the only way is to introduce full digital technology, and not just Citizen, okay? Citizen's just one part of it. I think governments have to have a direct service relationship to people on their phones.
I think
and if they don't have it,
I think
Yeah.
unquestionably we got to make voting easier, and whether it's through citizen or digitization or being able to go to any polling station rather than the one that's in your neighborhood, I think we've got to make voting easier. But let's come back to this political party for a second. I used to work. My very first job was working for Keg Restaurants. I was a waiter at the Keg, and then I did acquisitions for the Keg. And George Tidball, the owner, said, "Brian, people can't figure out what they want to do if you give them too many options. So I only give them 7 different steaks. That's it, period. Limit the number of options. Because if you've got too many options, you don't know what to do. You spend your whole time sort of thinking it through. Political parties end up coalescing the views, the policies around a few different things. And I think about, all the comments you hear about the Republican, nomination process in the US right now. What they're saying is if too many people run, Trump will win the nomination because all of the focus will be dissipated amongst too many different competitors. Don't you think we need political parties in municipal government? With 102 people running and a dog, no one can decide, and it's just that the name that's most known wins. No.
Well, I think what you're saying, what I hear you and Murray saying that you have in common is that whether we call it a political party or whether we call it some other aspect of technology that allows us to achieve the informed consent of individuals who are willing to grant us their powers, you need a system that allows you to filter through all of the many options. And you're right, Brian, the excessive ones to get to a narrower set of options from which we can draw more sense. That might be described by some as a barrier to entry that's actually quite fair and healthy and reasonable. What I'm arguing is that, yes, we need that. Yes, we need technological advancements to simplify the vote. Yes, we need the appropriate process improvements, but none of it will work and be worth a fig unless we layer onto that the reality of all political systems, whether they're democracies or not, which is, are they an accurate and true and relevant reflection of their cultural system? And so you can't dissociate a political system from a culture. And part of the reason I keep putting the emphasis back on the duty of citizens to do part of their job and the duty of people who are politicians and or political parties behaving better is I don't think we know whether or not we value democracy as much as we used to. We fought wars over it in World War I and World War II. I'm not sure we would be prepared to do that again this time around. And I'm not saying that we should have to do that, but what I'm saying is the fundamental question that we need to ask as a culture and as a society is, does our freedom to elect the people who we think are best suited to represent us, is that still a fundamentally important value to us or not? And right now, I think that we're getting contradictory signals to that question. On the one hand, we see evidence everywhere that democracy is declining. And by the way, Brian, on the question of political parties, democratic engagement is declining across all democracies, as Murray said, including and especially those where political parties are in place. And so I'm not sure it's a silver bullet in that regard. But to come back to my point, number one, we have to figure out whether we care about it. And number two, if we do, then we have to have an honest conversation about what it is that we share in common as a society and a culture that can get us back to the place where these big, intractable problems seem relevant and approachable enough to us to tackle. And that's maybe the last reflection that I'll offer, perhaps to end on I don't know if it's pessimistic, but realistic note. I think part of the challenge is some of these problems that we're grappling with as a society and a culture have become so big and so complex that we may actually have a natural sense of powerlessness in front of them, which disincentivizes us from participating in the vote. And, housing affordability would be a big one if I think about it from a generational perspective. The number of millennials and Gen Yers who tell me that they moved on from the dream of home ownership because it's just not relevant or attainable for them anymore is extraordinarily high. And likewise, so many of the issues that we link to climate change seem to have a very similar effect. And so I think there's parts of this that's cultural, there's parts of this that are psychological. Yes, there's parts that are systemic. Yes, there are parts that are technological, but until we see them as a whole, we're not going to make the progress that we want to on that issue.
My gosh, that's a little bit scary, but I guess we are hearing a lot of, particularly from the United States right now, in regards to, is democracy dead? And it would appear that a lot of people like democracy as long as their choice wins. And if their choice doesn't win, well, maybe I don't like democracy as much as I thought I did. We're going to take a final break and then come back with some concluding comments in just 2 minutes from Murray Simpson and Nick Rakowski. Stay with us, everybody. Welcome back, everyone, to the Brian Crombie Radio Hour on Saga 960. My guests tonight are Murray Simpson and Nick Rakowski. We've been having an interesting conversation about the Toronto Mayoralty election, but it's really elevated into a discussion about democracy and the state of democracy. And Nick has challenged us in regards to, do we really want the freedom to vote, or are we less interested in that today than we may have been in the past? And would we go to war to fight for it? Gentlemen, I think this Toronto Mayoralty election is really critically important, and I want you to come back to the election if I could. I think that if Nick, climate change was the issue for our generation globally, I think affordability is the issue for our generation municipally, provincially, and I think it's a huge issue. We have budget deficits, we have debt, we have property taxes that are out of whack with the surrounding communities. We are going to be the third largest city in North America, a vibrant metropolis of if you added up the whole Greater Toronto area, of 10 million people in the next couple of years. We've got no one sort of addressing that vision and where we're going and how we're going to get there and what type of city that we're going to be building. I think this is a really critically important election, but people just don't seem to be. Maybe it's because too many choices. Maybe it's because of the 100 people. Maybe it's because of the dog that's running. People just don't seem focused on how critically important it is. So what's the solution? What's your recommendations for what we got to do, and what's your message to Toronto voters that have got to go to the ballot box in the next couple of days? Murray?
So I want to leave this on a bit of an optimistic note. First and foremost, let's remember what Churchill said, okay? Democracy is the absolute worst system of all, except for all the others. So a lot of this stuff is table stakes. These are the issues of our times. These are the challenges of our democracies. The fact is, we wouldn't trade the system for any other. I think that's still fair to say. Right now, we don't have a perfect system, but we do have a system that's worthy, and it's one of the best in the world, top 5, top 10, depending on the year. To every Toronto voter, okay, you need to get out and you need to vote. This is a once every few years exercise. Toronto's election for the mayor is the single largest constituency in the entire country. Full stop. Okay, there are 1.8 million electors in this city. And that is way larger than the largest federal riding. Okay, and we have a lot of power together. So even if the system isn't perfect, even if you're busy, even if you're not there, please get out and vote. Grab your kids, take them with you, grab your husband and wife, go, grab your friends, talk about it, post on social media, do whatever you can. But at a minimum, get out and vote. You can't do mail-in voting anymore because that's over now, but you can get out and vote. And I'll say this, and to close out, I think that the prognosis for democracy is good. The fact that we're having these discussions, the fact that we have all of these debates, we've had a half dozen or a dozen debates with these candidates. This is a healthy democracy. Democracy is the hardest system, and I wouldn't trade it for the world. And I wish all the candidates luck, but I mostly wish to the voters that they go out and give their informed consent to those that are going to govern them.
Nick, last word to you.
Change is the only constant. That's true whether it's in a democracy or in a dictatorship or every system in between. I get that it causes us to think about things that make us uncomfortable. I get that sometimes it seems like a freight train that's too hard for us to grasp. I long ago resigned myself to just embracing change as the one constant reality in my life and getting comfortable with it. So it's not an impediment to me to vote. And I certainly hope it won't be an impediment to anybody else, because whether you vote or not, things will continue to change with and without your say-so over the course of time. So that's my first thought. my second thought is on the issue of affordability. If you think about any time there's been major disruptions and unrest and conflict at a global and or local and national scale, affordability, access to opportunity, access to resources has most often been the driver of those types of moments of unrest. And so, Brian, I agree with you that there's no more clear indication to me that this is a milestone elections for Torontonians than the fact that affordability and housing affordability in particular continues to be at the top of the list of ballot questions that are driving people's interest in the issues. And so whether or not the solution is out there amongst the candidates matters less than your ability to demonstrate just how much this election matters by participating in it and by making a choice that embraces the change and the ambiguity that's inherent to the system. And then in the long term, I'll simply say that we will get to a system that better reflects the culture in which we operate. It'll take some time, it always does. But the track record of our societies in the West and of societies in general is that they do evolve to reflect how their culture is moving. And so we're going to get there. It's just going to be a little bit bumpy along the way, but that's part of what makes it fun. So that'll be my last word on that matter.
Murray Simpson, Nick Rakowski, thanks so much for joining us and talking about both democracy and the Toronto Mayoralty election. Maybe I could end with my own thoughts on this. And that, I think, is when you're hiring someone for a senior position in a company, you're not asking them what their policies would be. You're not asking them what they would do. What you want is someone who's going to make the best decisions, because you understand that they may not know everything yet. They're not in the job yet. And so therefore, what you want is someone who can work with other people, who can listen to the different stakeholders, who is interested in listening to the different stakeholders, who will do good analysis, and in the end, make good, smart decisions. And I worry that that's not what we focus on enough. Is we've got to be, we're electing the CEO of the city effectively. And so we've got to be thinking about who do we think is going to be able to work with Premier Ford, with the federal government, the provincial government, with their fellow councillors. Even with strong mayor powers, they're only one vote, other than in a few cases on council. They're going to have to put together administration. Strong mayor powers do give them the right to appoint a bunch of deputy mayors. Who's going to be the best manager, the best executive, the best CEO, and assuming that whether it be affordable housing, affordability, or public safety, or climate change, or whatever the issue is, who's going to be able to in the future think about those problems, canvass the right people, get everyone else on board, and make the right decisions? That's who I think we've got to vote for. So, bottom line, get out and vote. Thanks so much.
Amen.
Nick,
amen.
All the best. That's our show for tonight. Thanks for joining us. Good night, everybody.